Just do whatever I want, YOLO. Right? And using that mentality, you will go about the business of completely wrecking your life because you don't think that there will be any eternal consequences.
And using that mentality, you will go.
But there are eternal consequences. As we begin to worship the creation, we start to worship money, we start to worship power, fame, popularity, we worship sexuality, we worship food, we worship cool music artists or our favorite YouTuber. Right? We begin to worship all sorts of things that are not God. And as we look at the rest of this passage, that's exactly what Paul begins to talk about as he starts giving examples of people who've begun to worship the creation rather than worshiping the Creator. And this is where we get to the hardest part of this passage that I've been dreading to teach you guys. Dreading and yet excited. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure God didn't think I was ready for this passage last week, so I asked my wife to go ahead and go into labor so I could have an extra week, to work on it for you guys. For those of you who didn't laugh, you have to realize that you can't actually ask somebody to go into labor. Happens on its own. All right, so here we go. Getting into verse 26, it says, "For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations with those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." Right? So, the issue of homosexuality. As we are teaching verse by verse through Romans, we can't dodge things. We have to teach the truth of the text. And this one is really clear. It says that when you begin to worship the creation rather than the Creator, when you worship your sexuality, when you worship your lusts, when your desires become the compass of your life rather than the truth of God, then things start going wrong. And one of those things that he talks about is homosexuality. Now, be very clear that when the Bible talks about this, it's talking about action. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But it says that women exchanged what was natural in nature for what was unnatural, and that men began to engage with men sexually, and that is against nature. And I have tried to negotiate this and write it out and figure out a way to say this nicely, and I think that was the reason why God kind of just laid it on me to take more time and to spend more time looking at it, and he just wants me to just be really straightforward. And so the Bible just really clearly says that homosexuality is not part of his design. Right? And here is a bunch of passages for you. Right? So in Corinthians, and this is not the verses themselves, this is kind of an explanation of what's in the verse. Start writing these verses down if you need a reference. Okay? There's lots of them. So here we go. So in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, homosexuality is listed among many other sins from which the believers in Corinth have been saved, have been forgiven, and have been sanctified. So there's a whole list of sins, and then Paul says, you all used to do these things, but now you've become Christians and you don't do them anymore. Right? So that's one reference. Mark is Jesus speaking. He says, but from the beginning, this actually is the verse, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man will leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Now here's the thing that's interesting about that. Jesus takes two verses, one from Genesis 1, one from Genesis 2, puts them together in this verse, and he deals with a very contemporary issue of ours. This whole concept of gender, gender identity, sexual orientation. And if you look at this verse, in the beginning it says, he made them male and female. In the Greek language, those are adjectives that are a man adjective and a female adjective. Male adjective, female adjective. Right? So they're descriptive words. And then further on it says, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And that word wife is married woman or woman. So it basically says a man will be joined to his woman. And so he also uses the nouns for man and woman. So Jesus really clearly ties together your gender of male or female and your sexual identity as being born male or female, or being born as a man or a woman. He ties those two things together. So they're not separated. And he says that marriage is between a man and a woman. There's not another way for that to happen. Now, as I've been studying this, there are lots and lots of arguments that people make to try and discount all sorts of these verses, to try to brush them under the rug. They do some fancy footwork, and they're just not reading the text in its plain version. But one thing you cannot get away from, even if you were able to move away from these verses on homosexuality, is you cannot get away from the very clear design that God had of making man and woman and them married. So, in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2, it teaches that the remedy for sexual temptation is for each man to marry a woman and each woman to marry a man. So again, it's very clear what marriage is in this context. Right? And then there's a list on the bottom there of some other verses. Romans 1, 26 to 27 is what we're looking at in Romans. Matthew is a restatement of the verse in Mark. Jude only has one chapter, so it's Jude verse 7. Genesis is the creation and God's command for us to be fruitful on the earth and to multiply. And the thing about it is that, again, this is against God's design, because just from the science perspective of it, a man with a man or a woman with a woman cannot produce offspring. That's the way God designed it. Because God designed it for a man to be with a woman and to produce offspring. And he commands us in Genesis to be fruitful and to multiply on the earth. And so that's the main thrust of the text. And it cannot be dodged, despite the fact that people try to dodge it. But then the next question is, how do we deal with that in our culture with people on a real basis who really are struggling with these things? Right? So here's the next thing, is the idea of predisposition. Can you be born gay? That's one of the big issues. And people go back and forth on this, so I'm not going to lay down the law and say this is what it is. But my personal take on it is that yes, you can be born with a predisposition towards being attracted to the same sex. And the reason for that is because we are in a broken world. The world is no longer how God designed it to be. When he created the garden, it did not look like this. And so that being the case, there are many predispositions that we are born with. As a matter of fact, most males are born with a predisposition to spread their seed as far as they can and sleep with as many women as they possibly can before they die. That's the general male predisposition. But does that line up with what the Bible says? No, it does not, because the Bible says that marriage is between one man, one woman, for their lifetime. Right? And that's not the only predisposition you can have. You can have a predisposition towards taking things that don't belong to you. You can have a predisposition towards being mean to people. You can have a predisposition towards greed, pride, gluttony, guilty. Right? You can have a predisposition towards all sorts of different sins because we are born sinful people. But, just like we talked about with the gospel, that's not the end of the story. That's the starting point. Our brokenness and how broken we are is the really bad news. But the really good news is that God can transform anything. That he's in the business of restoration and reformation. Right? And so, then the question is, does homosexuality become sin? And the clear answer to that is when it engages in action. And that's true of any kind of sin. So check out this verse in James. It says, but each person is tempted, right? So if we're talking about temptation or your predisposition to some kind of sin, temptation is not a sin. It is not sin to be tempted, because that's what Satan tries to do every day, all the time, right? So that's not the sin. Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. right? So the desires, again, are not sin. But then desire, when it has conceived, when action happens, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So at the point when you begin to engage in an activity of homosexuality, in an activity of sex outside of marriage, in an activity of theft or, any other things, theft or bad language or all sorts of things, that's when it becomes sin. And I also want to throw in as a caveat that Jesus talks about lust and about how if you look at a person in lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. So your action can be moving from, oh, that's a nice looking person or a pretty person or a beautiful person or a handsome guy, to starting to think about what could come after that. When that transitions from noticing somebody to starting to dwell on them and imagining things that might happen, that is lust, and that is also a sin, because you've moved from the temptation into an action, even though the action is only inside your own mind. Right? Okay. So, the other thing that I also want to make really clear is that homosexuality is not the point of this passage. We already talked about the point of the passage. The point of the passage is that we start messing up our lives when we worship the creation rather than the Creator. And when we move on from here, Paul begins to list all sorts of other things that you could be engaging in as you worship the creation rather than the Creator. So it goes on and it says in verse 28, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to debased minds to do what ought not be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness. And here's the list. Evil, covetousness, that's just wanting something that's not yours, like that Ferrari or something like that, right? Covetousness, malice, having anger towards people. They are full of envy, being jealous of people, thinking that what you wish that you were somebody else or that you had their situation in life. Right? Murder. That was pretty straightforward. No killing people, just so you know. Strife. Right? Fighting with each other. Having contention. Not having things be at peace with other people. If you're a person who causes and stirs up trouble, that's you. That's what strife is. Right? Lost my place. Hold on a second. All right, deceit. When you say things that aren't true, or when you leave things out that are true, or when you say something that's halfway true, but your intention is to get somebody to believe something that's not true. That's all deceit, and it's right here in the list. Maliciousness. Right? Just having a desire to inflict suffering on other people. All right. They are gossips, talking about somebody when they're not there. Sharing bad things about people or things that you don't like or how they frustrate you. And I do want to add in, sharing a prayer request about the sins that somebody's engaging in is also gossip. All right? You can pray for somebody without using specifics. God knows what's going on in every situation. All right? Slanderers. That's when you make fun of somebody. You say mean things about people that aren't true. Haters of God. Right? That one's pretty straightforward. Insolent. Meaning that you don't take things seriously. That you are cavalier about stuff and you don't recognize the gravity of situations that you're in. And you're kind of just, stubborn. It'd be the kind of thing where you're sitting in class and you're like, why is history important? I know at least one student in my class last year is going, oh, that was me. Right? Yeah, insolent. All right. Haughty. Right? Being proud. I am the best thing that's ever happened since sliced bread. Did you see me? I am so cool. Right? Boastful. So haughty is the attitude. Boastful is the words. Check me out, I'm awesome. Right? Ruthless. Meaning without kindness. that you do not care about the concerns of other people, you have no compassion towards people, you just do what you're going to do. And it goes on and says, oh, I missed a whole bunch of them. Hold on a second. Boastful. Okay, inventors of evil. When you come up with bad things to do, hey, let's sit around and make a plan to do something that we shouldn't do. Right? Here's one for you. Disobedient to parents. If you were not on this list before, I'm pretty sure you're on the list now. Right? And then it goes on to the end here. It says foolish, faithless, not trusting in God, not having faith, heartless, not caring. And then we talked about ruthless already. So the question is, are you on that list? Because like I said, homosexuality is one example, and then this list is a whole bunch of other examples. Homosexuality is not the main point of this passage. The main point of the passage is not worshiping God, but worshiping the creation, and then all the bad things that come from that. And I'm pretty sure that every one of us is on that list somewhere, sometimes. And that being the case, we have to recognize that everybody struggles with sin. And you do not get somebody to come close to Jesus or become a Christian by telling them how sinful they are. They already know. All you do is make them angry, make them defensive, put up a wall, or dig in a trench, and then it's like World War I, no, there's no movement. You just sit and shoot at each other. Right? And that's it. The way that you reach somebody and help them become a Christian is through love. It is God's loving kindness who draws all men to themselves. We have got to love people. That has to be our identity. Instead, 75% of polled Americans said that the number one characteristic of Christians is that they're judgmental. That's kind of the opposite of what Jesus said, that we should be people who love, that's our identity. Right? In Christ. So then that asks the question, what is your true identity? Because so many of these different things, slanderous, heartless, disobedient to parents, so many of these things can become your identity. But it's not your true identity because it's not based in worshiping the Creator, it's based in worshiping the creation. So, here's another verse for you. This is where we get our identity. I have been crucified with Christ. When you became a Christian, you died. Your life is crucified. You no longer exist. Jerry Dayton no longer exists. It is no longer I who live. Jerry does not live anymore. But Christ who lives in me, and the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. That is who you are when you're a Christian. And everything else is secondary to that, or even non-existent to that. Your identity is that you were crucified with Christ, and Jesus lives in you. Your identity is Jesus. All right, let's get into the last verse really quick here. The last verse says, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. All right? So here's the thing that I want you to recognize is that too often in our lives, we are silently accepting the things that are going on. That we approve of things that are wrong. And I think one of the biggest areas where we do this is in the media that we consume. And as I get older, maybe it is because I'm getting older, or maybe it's because God is just convicting me and showing me in His Word the truth of this. As I get older, there's more and more stuff that I don't watch anymore. I am a huge movie fan. I went to one movie this summer because there was nothing to see, in my opinion. There was just no good movies out because they're filled with all this garbage. And when we go and watch them, I mean, I used to have all these movies. Oh, my favorite movie is this movie. It has this one part that you have to fast forward, but I love this movie. Right? Well, if it's partly corrupted, the whole thing's corrupted. And we need to recognize those things, and we need to move away from those things. It says that he says that those who are far from God, who are worshiping the creation, they approve of all the bad stuff that goes on. So when you watch shows that are about drugs, that are about sex, that are about violence, all those kinds of things, you are silently approving of what's going on. When somebody says a racist joke or sexual joke in the hallway and you laugh, you're approving of what's going on. Right? And we can't do that as Christians. That can't be our identity. We need to be very clear that we have nothing to do with those things because God has made us a new creation. All right, so let's get to our challenges really quick because we're completely out of time almost. All right. So challenge 1 is seek God and discover what false identity you have been living under up until this point. And we're going to talk about this more next week. And challenge 2, so you can choose one or both of these challenges. I dare you to do both. Here's your second challenge. Pray for God to give you His perspective and then evaluate the media that you're consuming. What do you need to stop watching, reading, or listening to? Let me pray. And while I pray, the worship team can come up. Lord, I just thank you for this time that we can spend in your word. I pray that you would bless this time of worship. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to understand that our identity is in recognizing you as creator, that you've created us, and that you've created us for a special purpose. Lord, we love you so much, and we pray that you would help us to be people who love, who are accepting, not of sin, but accepting of people. That we recognize that you've created people, that they have intrinsic value, and that you love them, that you want to have a relationship with them. And the only way that that happens is through love, not through telling them how bad they are. And Lord, I just pray that you would speak that truth, that you'd help us to hold on to the truth, that anything that I, misspoke or didn't get right or was misunderstood today, Lord, I just pray that you would let that slide away. We love you so much, and we thank you for these things. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. If you have questions about any of this stuff, please come talk to me. Please talk to a teacher. All right? I can't do it all. I can't cover the whole thing in just this one thing. This needs to be a series, but we don't have time for it. And so, can I go ahead and stand up for worship? During this first song, guys, take a few minutes, pray with your buddy. That's why you're sitting with them. Ask them how they're doing, pray for them.
Thank you. So change of order, praise team. We're going to start with the altar mother praying with your mentor. And then we're going to go back to the first song. We'll come to the altar. So you guys are praying with your buddies, right? You're praying.
Have you come to the end of yourself? tell the world of the treasure you found. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ.
I'm really sorry, guys. We only have time for one more song instead of two. And I apologize to the worship team because I know you guys practice really hard. And so that's not normally going to happen. Just this topic was a tough one. As you guys are thinking about your identity, that's what I'd like you to do for this last song, is you're worshiping the Lord and asking Him what your true identity is and what the false identity is that you've been living under up to this point. I want you to consider this passage. I'm in Psalm 139, and it starts in verse 13, and it says, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in the secret, intrinsically woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance," and this is one of my favorite parts of the whole Bible. "In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them." Before you were born, God created all your days and knew all your steps and had a plan for each one of you guys. You have to know that. I love you guys. One more song and then go ahead and head to class. We're going to be a little bit late.
So this will be our last one. Who you say I am. You guys, if you want to come forward, you can do that. This is our last one. Here we go.
I was lost, but He brought me.
Caleb.